Thank you, Nathan. Good morning. Well, we're going to continue talking about, as I promised last Sunday, talking about why we gather together or why we should gather together. And these are some things that we've talked about already just to kind of base us or ground us as we get started today. We talked about loneliness kills. We've talked about the need that we have for friends. We talked about the danger of being isolated. And we talked about from Hebrews 10 the importance of encouraging. And Nathan talked about that this morning too. I was a little bit concerned when Nathan gets up and says, I hope I don't disagree with anything Rudy's already taught. And I'm like, well, just teach what the Bible says, and we should be okay. If we both do that, we should complement each other, and we did. You did. So we're really coming at that particular passage just all the way around, and I appreciate that. I do want to add a list or a text to the list from Ecclesiastes. If you'd like to turn there, or just listen while I read. This is a passage that we haven't shared yet, but I keep thinking about it, and it just fits in here really well. So for those of you who have been taking notes and studying in between this, I wanted this to be a part of the text that you're listening. So, Ecclesia chapter 4, beginning at verse 9, a very familiar passage, I think, to most of us. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up, but pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Just a lot of evidence there about how important it is for us to be supporting each other and gathering together and being together. And I want to make this point too, and I think Nathan was making a similar point this morning. When we're talking about this gathering together, it's very inclusive. It's not just about the worship service. And as I say that, I don't mean to diminish the significance of this gathering in this moment for the purpose that we've gathered. But I do want to make the point that so many things that we've already looked at and will continue to look at have to happen outside an assembly like this, because this assembly doesn't allow for all of those things to take place. For example, what Nathan was referring to this morning from Hebrews 10, about the encouraging one another, spurring one another on, and actually working together. So many applications outside. So not to diminish this, but to build on it, if you will, and the importance of gathering together and understanding that it's so much more than this time together. And this exactly what I was saying. I hope we're starting to see that. Now, I wanted to go back to a word that really stood out to me, and this has caused me to shift my message to us this morning. I promised you that we would be in Acts chapter 2, and we'll get there, just not in any depth, okay? We're just not in any depth. We'll do that next time. And next time will be 2 weeks from today, because next Sunday is Nathan's Sunday to preach, as with our schedule right now. So Nathan, if you forgot that, you got a whole week yet to get ready. So just I know, it's always good. I know, right? But something that stood out to me, a word in this passage and also in this passage that we'll look at in a moment from John 13, is this word example. And I talked a good deal about this last week. Let no one despise you, the older mentoring minister saying to a younger minister. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example. And he's very specific about some things that this young preacher should model, if you will, for his congregation. Speech, conduct, love, faith, purity. If you think about that, be an example, young preacher, to the congregation about how to live as a child of God. And I think it's really important when we look at that word example, it's not just about telling them what to do, but showing them what to do by doing it in your own life. It's that word example. I really want us to focus on how important that is. And what Jesus said to us in the story of washing the disciples' feet, for I have given you an example. And I love that Jesus answers the why. Why? Because I want you to do this. You need to do this. You need to do as I have done. And so let there be absolute clarity about what that is. I'm going to show you. Again, it's not just the telling, but the showing. And the point that I made last week about from these two passages that I want to reiterate is that those examples of what to do, specifically here, it was about service, right? It was about service. And with Paul's instruction to a young preacher, it was about teaching them to live a godly life. And where does that example take place? Is it here? Well, sure, it's certainly part of it, but it's a little part of it when you think about serving, when you think about living out there in the world. And so the point that I want us to understand is that example, we've got to gather together in multiple ways, in multiple places, in order to exemplify these things that we've been asked to do. So, that's what I want to talk about this morning. How important is an example? And I came across some material that was interesting to me because it was from a management perspective. And so my work it really resonated with me because of my work as an administrator. And so as you listen to that and kind of hear that management language in this, please don't dismiss it and realize that this has application to us. If it didn't, I wouldn't share it with you. So how important is an example? How often do you start doing what you want to see others doing? In other words, how important is that example in the model of leadership? And again, just because I said leaders here, don't turn this off, say, oh, he's not talking about me. I'm not a leader. We're all leaders. We are all leaders in some form or fashion and in varying degrees. You're a leader within your own little community, your family, where you work. And you may have varying responsibilities in those leadership roles, but we all have leadership responsibilities, and we'll build on that a little bit later. But thinking about that again, how often do you start doing what you want to see others doing? An example that came to my mind as I thought about this point is the advice that I've often given in years past when I've done marriage counseling. When I hear couples lamenting how their relationship is and how they're going to change it, my advice has often been, be what you want your spouse to be. And part of the reason that I think that's significant advice is your spouse may not know how to be what you want them to be. And you got to teach them. And how do you teach them? Well, you teach them by example. You demonstrate, you model, if you will. In many ways, it's kind of a mentoring process. But you have to show them how to do that. Something else to realize, too, is if you're feeling, for example, in a relationship, whether it's with your spouse or your children, that you're experiencing some disrespect, it may be that you're just getting back what you're modeling, the example that you are to them. I mean, if you're feeling that you get some impatience from your children, chances are pretty good they're feeling some impatience from you. If you're getting some disrespect from your children, chances are pretty good they have felt some disrespect from you as well. And they're just giving back to you what you've equipped them to do by your example. So if you want that to change, first we need to check our own example. And man, it's hard. It's really hard because it's much easier to just take the position, well, if they would just do it this way. You know, I'm famous for this. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. Just do it my way. I mean, that works for me, right? That works for me. But we giggle about that, but that's where most of us really are. Demanding that things will get better when you make the changes that need to be made. Now, it can be frustrating and it can take a while for those positive examples to change those behaviors. But it will work. It truly will. And it comes back to this little thing that we were all taught by our parents, and I hope have taught our children. Treat others the way that you want to be treated. I think that has some root in the Bible, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Sure it does. How often do you example the way you want people in your organization to work and behave? And again, that word organization could be family, could be the congregation, could be your workplace, whatever it is. But again, how often do you example the way you want people around you to work and behave? This caused me to think of something that I've shared in past. Being an educator, I love the love and logic philosophy. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's outdated, but it's some older material, this idea of love and logic. And within this teaching, this love and logic material, I find this phrase, it says, practice, don't punish. And the application of this is the idea that often we punish people when they don't do what we expect them to do, but the problem is that they don't know how to do it. And so we actually end up often punishing and leveling, laying out consequences to people who never even had a chance to meet those expectations because they didn't know how to. You know, a simple illustration like this is a teacher barking at a student or a principal barking at a student for running down the hallway. You know, when you're a little kid, hallways in schools are made for running. You know, they just are. They just are. But we come along as adults and say, no, they're not. And you need to walk, you know. And when kids first come into my school, they've got a lot of things they need to learn about how to behave in school. And one of them is walking in the hallways. And so I see a teacher, or I have to remind myself when I'm barking at a student for running down the hallway, I have to ask myself, have they ever been taught not to? Has that ever been explained to them? And so the idea is practice, don't punish. So when we see somebody messing up and not meeting that standard, it's the idea of assuming they don't know how to do it, and now it's my responsibility to help them understand and learn what those expectations are. So rather than getting, all frustrated that they're being disobedient, I take the attitude, they need some coaching. They need some learning. And I approach it that way. Changes the relationship dramatically as well. So if people don't know how, we can't expect them to do it. So have we taught them. Teaching my staff cooperative learning. I put that up there just to remind me of a story. I was professionally rebuked recently by our instructional coach at school. And I had to be reminded of something. Years and years ago, I brought a type of learning to my staff. And it was something that I was very passionate about. It was something that we talked a lot about. It was something that I modeled. It was something I shared a lot of examples. It was something that I expected my teachers to use in the classroom, and to help them learn that, I would use it at our staff meetings. And because of all of that, because of all the modeling, because of all the examples, there was a clear understanding of the expectations, and the implementation of this particular philosophy went very well. And we were struggling with trying to get an initiative going recently. And so my instructional coach kind of took me aside and said, "Do you remember when we did this Kagan cooperative learning thing and how it worked so well?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, that was because of the teaching you did, the examples that you did, the modeling that you did is the reason it worked so well. And the reason we're struggling right now to get this initiative going is because you're not modeling it. You're not being the example. You're not providing the instruction necessary to make this happen." And so that was a cold, hard slap in the face. And I needed it. And it just reminded me, how many times do we place expectations on each other and never realize that the reason we don't meet those expectations is because we simply don't know how? Evangelism, outreach. Why do we struggle with that? Could it be because we don't know how? Or we're not doing it in effective ways or even organized ways or in any way? I'd like to think that, well, isn't it true there's some fear in that, isn't there? And what does that fear come from most often? Not knowing? And whose fault is it if you don't know? Who hasn't taught you? I'm sorry. We need to work on that. We need to work on that. And I commit to you to do that. In fact, as I keep rethinking the material that we'll get back to about rightly handling the word, I think that's a great platform to use to talk about and to teach, to model, to provide some examples about how to evangelize. Because what better result could there be from learning how to rightly handle God's word, being in a position to share it that others might be motivated to follow it? Okay. Again, how important is an example? How often do you show your team members, again, team members, your family, the congregation, the people that you work with, your neighborhood, how often do you show your team members how they can fulfill the vision by setting an example? Again, being that example. You know, let's just back up a minute. A couple of things about this point. Think about what an example is. Just think about that. Define it. What is an example? I would imagine some of you are thinking, well, the definition of an example is seeing how something is done, right? I mean, I think that's probably a pretty clear-cut, accurate definition of an example. So, are we putting out those examples and clearly helping people to understand what the standard is and what the expectation is? But this point also raises another concern for me, is this: to fulfill the vision. Do we have a vision? Do you have a vision? Do you have a purpose? Now, this can happen in big ways as an organization, as our congregation. Do we have a vision for ourselves as a congregation? And some of you might be quick to say, yeah, it's to get to heaven. It's to bring glory to God. Well, I want to suggest to you that's a little vague. Because how do you do that? How do you do that? And we need people to give us examples of how to do that. But if we have a clear vision, then we can also think about, okay, what are the action steps? What is the things that we need to do to reach that objective, to reach that vision, okay? And then we have an idea of what it is we need to exemplify, what it is that we need to teach, what it is that we need to model, how it is we need to be mentoring each other. Gandhi. I came across the story of Gandhi I thought was pretty interesting. Something that Gandhi said that he's famous, one of the things that he's famous for is be the change you want to see in the world. Be the change. Again, it kind of goes back to that idea is that, as soon as Kathy starts doing things reasonably, my way, we will grow as a couple, I'm just going to move over here. Okay? But we know that, right? We know that. But Gandhi would say, Mr. Hemister, be the change. Be the person that you want Kathy to be. Be the change you want to see in the world. Oh, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. But I think it's an important one. And it's one that requires another biblical concept that we talk a lot about. Picking up our cross, dying to self, okay? You see, when I'm willing to put my needs aside to meet your needs, it works pretty good for you. And as I am an example of that, somewhere along the line, then you start meeting my needs. And now we're both satisfied. We're both stronger. We're both encouraged. We both are in a position to grow and do more, okay? The story is told of Gandhi that he would never give advice without firsthand knowledge, without being able to be the example first. So a mother brings her child to Gandhi, and she's trying to influence the child's life to make better decisions in life. And so she says, Gandhi, I need you to tell my kid to cut down on sugar and quit eating so much sugar. And the story is told that Gandhi looked at this woman and says, come back in 15 days. That was it. So the mom comes back with her son in 15 days, and Gandhi looks at the boy and says, you need to cut down on your sugar. And the woman says to Gandhi, why couldn't you tell him that 15 days ago? He said, because I didn't know. I'd never cut down on my sugar. So I spent 15 days cutting down on my sugar to see if it would make a difference. Again, it's just that idea about Gandhi is that he would never ask you to do something without finding out first if it was the right thing to do, without first being an example. And you might think that a silly story, and to be honest, I don't think it's an actual true story. It's just to make that point of how important that example was to his style of teaching. People need a sample. The importance of an example is that people need a sample. One of the differences between leaders and followers is that followers need a model or a sample from those leaders to have that benchmark. Again, to have a clear understanding of what the expectations are. Some of you may remember, it's been well over a year ago, and we were meeting on Zoom. And it was shortly after the holidays, and we were just sharing some stories over Zoom after the Bible study about what was going on and just kind of catching up. And I had shared with you that I had gotten a guitar. I bought myself a guitar, and I was going to start learning how to play the guitar. Well, the first thing that I needed was some examples. So where's the best place in the world to find examples if you want to learn something? Yeah, YouTube. YouTube is all about examples. How many of you have ever learned to do anything from watching a YouTube video? And if you don't have your hand up yet, you are missing out on a life-changing experience, let me tell you. But, you can ask Kathy. But I spend a lot of time on YouTube looking at examples of how to play this or play that. I'm doing it all the time. And then Kathy hears the results. Sometimes it's better than other times. But I'll just let you just ask her, is he getting better or not? Is what he's saying about following these examples, is it true? I'm no Chet Atkins yet, but I do like looking at his examples too. But people need that sample. They need to see how to do things. And again, setting that example is a very powerful way to do that. Also, those examples provide confidence. When we see people being successful, we kind of come away with, I could do that. I could do that. I might not be very good at it, but with some practice, I could get better at it. And so seeing the examples of others can really help us to gain the confidence that we would need to be able to do something. How many of you have ever bungee jumped? You just haven't seen enough examples yet, that's all. But we had a member of the church, Bruce was his name, up at Candio High, and he went bungee jumping, and they had a videotape of it. He actually had metal filings under his fingernails too, where they had to pry his fingers off the basket and more or less push him off of there. But part of what gave Bruce the confidence to be able to do that was he watched other people do it, and he watched them do it successfully. He was still terrified when he did it. In fact, he went up to the basket and he wanted to come back down, and he was wearing a Christian Witness t-shirt. And the guy says to him, he said, "Don't worry about it, you're a Christian, it'll be fine," kind of thing. Well, anyways, he did it. Again, how important is an example? If you don't do it, it will never get done. This idea sometimes of, many of us have great and creative ideas, but however, if we fail to implement them by taking the first steps, because too often we think it's the job or the responsibility of somebody else. I'm the idea guy. You're the one that's supposed to make it work. And the problem with that, again, is if we fail to set that example about how to do it and the importance of doing it, things just don't get done. And again, I've said this too. We set that standard through our example. If you cannot example the way, then you may not be a leader. Okay? You may not be a leader. And I'll put it this way. You may not be the leader yet. But I truly believe this statement that leading by example is a necessary characteristic of all leaders. And we are all leaders. I've made this point. We are all leaders in the same sense that we are to lead people to God through Jesus Christ. How important is our example in fulfilling the Great Commission? Think about that. Think about the things that you've learned about being a member of our Lord's church. How many of you men can remember the first time that you were asked to lead a prayer? A little nervous? I see. As soon as I asked that question, some of you started shaking. It's like, how did you learn to do that? Examples, right? Examples. You heard others doing it. Did somebody sit down and coach you? Probably not, but maybe. Preachers in here. Anybody who's ever did a sermon or taught a class, how did you learn to do that? You learned to do that most likely by watching and seeing and paying attention to the example of others that were doing it. We could go on and on with that list. How important is an example? Listen carefully. My home is what it is because of my example. My office, my school, is what it is because of my example. Good or bad. Okay? My relationships are what they are because of my example. You see, my example is me. Let that sink in a little bit. My example is me. So what are you putting out there? What are you putting out there? The importance of gathering is to be an example to each other, reflecting to each other the glory and the will of God. And all of those characteristics of being a child of God and learning to do it better. Better. Remember, we are all examples. It's just a matter of what kind of example do you want credit for? I mean, think about that. I've been talking about examples all morning, and the reality is we are all examples. But are we a good example or a bad example? The reality is I'm both. I'm both. But what do I want to be more often than not? A good example or a bad example? Here we are, finally, to Acts chapter 2. And I just want to look at this from the topic of today, being example. Next time we're together in 2 weeks, getting back to this series, we'll go into more depth about the example of those first century Christians recorded for us in Acts chapter 2. But for right now, let's wrap up the lesson and just make a point here. Beginning at verse 46, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. I've shared this point numerous times over the years from this particular text, and so many of you can probably remember where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is this. How did people respond every day? How was it that the Lord added to their number day by day? And who did he add? Those who stepped up and said, I want Jesus Christ to be Lord and Master of my life. I want to obey the gospel through baptism. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want to participate in it as Paul taught the Romans through baptism. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want my sins washed away. Why were so many people doing this? I'd like to suggest to you it's because as they were praising God, that first congregation of God's people, as they were praising God, having favor with all the people, what I want you to see in that is that they were setting an example of how God made a difference in their lives. They were truly an example of the good news, and people saw that and they wanted that good news. They wanted to experience what they saw these people had. The uniqueness of the relationship, not just with each other, but with God, the creator of the universe. And because of that example, because of that congregation clearly demonstrating what God's expectations were, they wanted part of it. And they knew from that example exactly what they needed to do. And they confessed their sins. They had their sins washed away. And they committed to living life in a new way. Think about how exciting that was. Not just for those new Christians joining every day, but for those who were exemplifying the faith and seeing how it changed their, not just their life, not just their family's life, not just the community, but the world in which they lived in. The example of a congregation. How important was that to the growth of the Lord's church? So the question I ask in our invitation this morning is, are you the example the world needs in order to find their way to God? Are we, as a congregation, the example that this community needs in order to find their way to God? This begins with you first finding your way to God. This is the most important example that you will ever give to the world. Your obedience to the gospel. And if you're here and ready to make that an example for us and the world to see, won't you come while together we stand and sing this song of encouragement?